We might have to start the recording again, I think. Resume the recording.
Can you get to the second slide?
Yeah.
What are ocean shipping alliances? Okay. Ocean shipping alliances are organizations among liner carriers like conferences, super conferences, etc. These organizations enter into agreements among their liner members. There are numerous types of agreements among liners carriers, for example, consortia, conference and cooperation agreements, discussion agreements, joint agreements, slot charter agreements, vessel sharing agreements. Shipping alliance agreements are cooperation agreements on a global scale between liners. These agreements cover utilization of ships, sailing schedules and itineraries, containers, and use of joint terminals. These agreements do not cover commercial aspects of shipping, for example, joint sales, marketing, pricing, joint ownership of assets, pooling of revenues, or loss sharing or joint management. The next slide. The evolution of ocean shipping alliances. First known ocean shipping alliance is believed to have been formed in 1990 between Maersk and CILTNA. Some question this as it was a vessel sharing agreement. The year in which new alliances are formed are shown in the slide. 1990 Maersk and CILTNA, 1994 Global Alliance, 1995 Grand Alliance, 1998 New World Alliance, New United Alliance and CKYH, 2011 and 12 G6 Alliance, and MSC CMA CGM Alliance, 2014-15 2M Alliance, and Ocean 3 Alliance, and 2017 D Alliance. The evolution is shown in the next slide. It shows when one alliance left and another alliance was formed. It's a bit in fine script here, but you'll see as you go right towards the right, some of the alliances on the left disappear and they merge into the new alliances because the terms of the agreement had expired. Turn to the next slide. The chart also shows that the number of alliances peaked in 1998, reaching 5 and then falling to 3 in 2017. The importance over time is shown in their market shares. In 1996, it was something like 23.8%. In July 2007, it was 46.8%. And in June 22, it was 82.8%. As a result, the Hirschman Index, a measure of concentration, jumped from 189 to 580 and then to 2,450. That is a jump from the unconcentrated level to a concentrated level.
Next.
Now I turn to the next slide. Mergers and acquisitions in the liner shipping industry. There are two major merger periods that were noted in the last 30 years, 1997 to 2005, and then 2015 to 2018. The mergers in the above period were of significance in that it determined and solidified the structure of shipping lines and their rankings. For example, Maersk bought P&O and Ned Lloyd, making it the first carrier. CMA CGM bought Delmas, making it the third carrier. NYK, MOL, and K merged, making it the sixth carrier. OCL and Costco merged, making it the fourth carrier. As a result, the market share of the top 10 carriers increased from 32.7% in 1996 to 60% in 2007, and then to 84.6% in 2022. As a result, 9 of the top 10 carriers are in one of the alliances. The HHI, as I mentioned, the Hirschman Index, of the top carriers has risen from 113 in 1996 to 1,011 in 2022. That is from the unconcentrated to the barely concentrated level. These modules are shown in the chart hereafter. It's a bit thin, fine, so you might not be able to see it very well, but it indicates the carrier, the acquirer, the target, and then the year in which the acquisition took place. So it gives you for the entire 30 period, all the merger acquisitions that took place. Turn to the next slide. The competition concerns. Initially, most viewed shipping alliances as beneficial, as their market share was small, but over time, this view began to be challenged. The first report to sound alarm bells was the FMC report in 1997. Its concern was that shipping alliances may replace conferences and act as conduits for rate and service fixing, that it would reduce competition and discourage entry of competitors. It would result in little or no intra-alliance competition. It viewed shipping alliances all as long-term investments that were not easily reversible. Turn to the next slide.
Okay, and actually, Joseph, just whilst you're carrying on, just to let everybody know, we will have time at the end for questions, so we can kind of come back to any of these points once you've got through this.
Okay. The next report that raised alarm bells was the GSE report in 2016. It examined the implications of megaships and shipping alliances for competition and supply chains. It questioned the prevailing wisdom that shipping alliances and vessel sharing agreements are good for competition. It indicated with parameters of competition such as capacity sailing, frequency, and ports removed, there would be few large independent lines. Would this be better for competition than a large number of allied lines? They indicated that it would result in 6 or 10 major carriers controlling the major trade lanes. The new increased market share would then present a real threat to competition. It may require new competition and regulatory approaches. Next slide. The next report that raised alarm bells was the OECD report in 2018. It indicated that global alliances are a dominant feature of container shipping. The 3 alliances represent something like 80% of container trade and 95% of container capacity on east-west trade. It identified several impacts: concentration of port networks, bigger cargo ships when alliances or members change ports or networks, buying power within the ports, which create destructive competition between terminal operators, port service providers, and towing companies. It raised competition concerns such as a rise in entry barriers to entry, facilitation of collusion, monopsony power, declining rates for port services, vertical integration by carriers and terminal operators. In light of the above, the report recommended removal of the block exemption, improving project appraisal, and establishing more coherent policies to reduce inefficiencies. By saying removing exemption, I mean removing the exemption from the antitrust law, namely the Sherman Act, and which the Shipping Act grants them once the FMC has approved the agreement. The next report that sounded the alarm bells was the US antitrust investigation into shipping alliances in 2017 and 19. In 2017, the US DOJ began an investigation after 2 alliances became operational. In fact, you might recall that they raided a meeting on ships. In 2009, the DOJ closed the investigation. I suspect the investigation was probably sparked by 2 other investigations and charges that were laid under the Sherman Act, namely the roll-on, roll-off carriers. And the second investigation was the US mainland Puerto Rico trade. Now, that's the next slide. Recent developments and concerns. The first major development that has occurred was the Hanjin bankruptcy. Some of you all may recall that Hanjin was one of the major companies in the shipping industry. It was the 5th largest company in the shipping industry. It was also the largest shipping company in South Korea. In 2009, it suffered a loss of $1 billion, and by 2015, it suffered a loss of $5 billion, and South Korean courts declared it bankrupt. Its bankruptcy caused worldwide supply chain and shipping disruption. This had a ripple effect, glut ships, excess capacity, plummeting rates, loss for the entire shipping industry. And in 2015, you'll recall that the industry lost something like $15 billion. Commentators on the industry indicate that you don't have to just merely put these ships out to pasture, but you should actually destroy those ships. Turn to the next slide. Amendments to the U.S. Shipping Act in 2018. The amendments to the Shipping Act was basically to protect port service providers, tugboat operators, MTOs from the collusive behavior of ocean carriers, and to give the FMC power to monitor anti-competitive behavior. It prohibits agreements between conference and 2 or more liners and MTOs to prevent use of power. In other words, they don't want the liners ganging up against some of the service providers, inland service providers. It prohibits carriers from participating simultaneously in a rate agreement and an agreement to share vessels if that has a substantial effect on, likely to have a substantial effect on competition through, say, for instance, the rise in prices and so forth. It expanded the remedies available to the FMC, both conjectural and civil. In other words, it required the FMC also to consider a substantial lessening of competition, and they could also consider things like whether its impact on other aspects of the maritime industry. It empowered the FMC to require filing reports by carriers and MTOs. It required the FMC to file reports to Congress. The FMC could also tighten control over intermediaries, for example, bond requirements, insurance requirements, etc. Now turn to the next slide. COVID-19, rebounding in demand, disruption in supply chain, higher freight rates, and soaring profits. COVID-19 caught everyone unprepared. Global maritime trade contracted by 12%. This had an effect on container liner services, and the capacity likewise declined by 12%. The pandemic unfolded in phases and at different periods, causing a succession of shocks and waves, each setting off their own spin-offs. Port activity slowed down as measures had to be taken to slow COVID-19, and ships spent more time in ports. As a result, maritime transport was disrupted not only in the United States, but worldwide. Turn to the next slide. Rebounding in demand led to a disruption of shipping of supply chains. As demand rebounded at the beginning in the second half of 2020, Asia to North American trade jumped 36% by third quarter of 2020 and continued to grow in 2021 by 30% in the second quarter. It caused capacity and other seafarer problems, putting a great strain on the supply chain. It led to unexpected demand for goods, both the pent-up demand for consumers and a shift of demand for consumers from service sector to the manufactured sector, because they could not go to restaurants and many of these service industries. As a result, causing American consumers to increase their demand for imports. This broke the supply chain in 2021, and most of y'all who look at the news would see pictures of ships outside the coast of California. This resulted in a container shortage. It led carriers also to send empty containers back to China. Turn to the next slide. As a result of this container shortage, by the end of 2020, freight rates had surged to unexpected levels. And by the second quarter of 2021, it had reached new records. The cost of a 40-foot equivalent unit container was 9 times higher than the cost in February 2019. China to West Coast was roughly $15,898 per container. Profits as a result soared. For example, from 1.6 billion in the first quarter of 2020 compared to 27.1 billion in the same quarter of 2021. Profits in 2020 were 25.4 billion in 2020, and in 2021 it was 190 billion. To give you an idea of it, 10 years before the pandemic, the average profits in the industry was between 750 million and 1 billion. And in 2021, it was 190 billion. That is, it would take you 190 years to get that much profit if it continued as the old ways. In 2022, profits are expected to be near 300 billion, but I think this is a slight overestimate because container prices have slightly come down on the West Coast. Now we'll turn to the next slide, questionable practices by the shipping lines. There are two practices that have been highlighted. One is demurrage and detention charges, and the next one is empty containers. First, demurrage and then detention charges. Shipping lines provide their shippers with containers, and they give them a few free days in the port and a few free days outside the port. If the shipper takes more than the time given by the liner, they have to pay demurrage charges and detention charges depending on where extra time is spent. As a result, in 2018, the FMC undertook an investigation as a result of a petition by the shippers because their demurrage and detention charges have skyrocketed. The FMC report found that the D&D charges had increased dramatically between 2014 and 2017, something between 350% to 400%. This report made 4 recommendations. It called for transparency, simplification, types of evidence needed to resolve cases, notice of a container availability, and it also recommended the establishment of a shipper advisory board. Slightly after this period, on June 14, the Commissioner of Enforcement Bureaus of the FMC reached a $2 million settlement agreement with Hapag-Lloyd, one of the liners, regarding unquestionable assessment of detention and demurrage charges. I thought the next issue, namely empty containers. This became a major issue when the agricultural sector complained that they could not get containers to send their exports. Shipping lines found it more profitable to send the empty containers back to China rather than to the agricultural sector because it was more profitable to send manufactured goods from China than the agricultural goods. 2 liners were suggested. Reports were made that 2 liners were sending more empties back than filling them with manufactured goods. The FMC has begun an investigation to empty carriers under the expanded powers of the recent Shipping Act. Then down to the next slide. Recent developments in the US and amendments to the US Shipping Act in June 22. As a result of the high shipping costs, President Joe Biden signed an executive order. It was named Promoting Competition in the American Economy on July 9, 2021. In fact, it's right now it's about 1 year since that executive order was signed. It indicated after that there has been a closer cooperation between the FMC and the US Department of Justice. There have been 3 fact-finding investigation reports by the FMC Commissioner Rebecca Dye on rulemakings by the FMC. The final report by the Commissioner made 12 recommendations. The report did not find that the high market prices for liner services were the result of collusive or illegal conduct. as you all probably are hearing all the news these days, the Ocean Shipping Competition Act of 22 became law on June 16, 2022. Major amendments were a new provision ensuring a competitive maritime transportation system, new provisions for a national shipping exchange registry, new provisions for data collection, and new FMC reports on regulated ocean common carriers. But the most important provision, as far as shippers are concerned, was a new provision for complaints about charges. Namely, shippers could take their complaints about charges to the FMC. And they also expanded the list of prohibited common carrier activities that a shipper could complain about. For example, if they were refused supply on liners and they felt that it was unfair, regarding invoicing and regarding charges that carriers made. Now then to the final conclusion. The ocean shipping alliances have recently emerged and now account for more than 80% of liner capacity. A wave of mergers and acquisition also occurred in liner shipping in two periods, 1997 to 2005, and 2015 and 2018. This has resulted in an increase in concentration in the liner industry, with the largest 9 shipping lines in the 3 alliances. The emergence of very large ships also aided this process. This led to questions. How will it affect competition and rates? This compounded with the arrival of COVID-19 had unexpected and unanticipated effects. It broke the supply chain, leading to unbelievable rate increases and extremely high liner profits. Of course, this affects governments in all parts of the world. It contributed to inflation not seen in decades. In fact, the news today on US inflation rates indicates there's 9.1% for the last month. This has called for investigation and for revisions to the competition laws governing shipping. In the US, as I mentioned, it led to the recent Ocean Shipping Antitrust Enforcement Act. In the rest of the world, there were joint investigations between Canada, Australia, Great Britain, and United States. Will this succeed in lowering prices for ocean transportation? Maybe, if it is a result of anti-competitive behavior. If not, the debate between shippers and ship owners will continue. Shippers will say, or repeal the antitrust exemption that liner carriers have from the Sherman Act, because it leads to conscious parallelism and rate fixing. On the other hand, the ship owners will say that's not true. It's all a result of real factors, real demand and supply factors. The high rates are because of COVID-19 and because of the supply chain was broken. And so policy makers are left in the middle, but the problem is still there. The inflation is still there, and most policy makers throughout the world are trying to see if they can get rid of it. Some of them are even raising the listing rates that the federal government charges the banks and so forth. So this is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, be free to ask. But first, I should mention that when the alliances file agreements with the FMC, once it is approved, they get an exemption from the Sherman Act. The Sherman Act is basically, it says that if there's collusion among carriers and it affects the trade, restraint of trade, intertrade in the United States, they could be prosecuted, and it's a criminal activity. In Canada, we have the Competition Act, which is under the conspiracy provisions, Section 45, is unduly lessening of competition. Then, of course, this thing results in it's a criminal offense, and the fines are quite hefty. So people have, for the last 30 years, have argued, why should shipping ocean carriers get the special antitrust exemption from the Sherman Act in the United States or from the Competition Act in Canada, or in the EU, they've removed that exemption, but consortia have an exemption. And in Australia, they have an exemption from the Trade Practices Act. Why should the shipping industry get this exemption? Traditionally, the argument has been two. On the economic front, they say that this industry suffers from instability. Excessive competition will lead to nothing but cutthroat competition, lower rates, and finally a monopoly, and it will not get you into any better position. And they've used various economic theories to justify the position. The cartel monopoly theory, you have the core theory, you have contestability theory, the Austrian theory, and so forth and so forth. So the question remains, and the second argument that they use is more political argument. You want international comity. Other countries have given them the exemption, so you have to give them the exemption too. Many people have questioned this as whether this is a reliable. Should we sacrifice efficiency for international comity? Is there a justification for doing so? So that's basically the whole argument right now that is happening not only in the United States, because they have another bill in front of Congress, which is to repeal the antitrust immunity. Similarly, in Australia, Productivity Commission is right now deliberating on whether they should repeal the immunity from the Trade Practices Act, and whether they should follow some type of a block exemption like the EC. Because in the European community in 2018, they repealed the exemption for conferences. But this is alliances, because conference had conference agreements, but they were much more wider because there were agreements on commercial aspects, price fixing and so forth. But these alliances are basically non-commercial agreements. They agree on space on the ships and so forth, schedules, itineraries and so forth, and terminals and so forth. And this is, they say, this is an efficiency enhancing, because today you have no longer small ships or medium sized, very large ships. And to get the economies of shipping, they have to share capacity among the carriers. The liners share capacity and they form alliances. So that's about anything. If you have any questions and all, please feel free to ask. If I can, I will. But as it is a very fluid topic, it's very current in the United States, current in Canada, the EU, and in Australia too.
Yep. No, absolutely. So, Joseph, you're absolutely right. It's definitely a hot topic. I mean, thank you very much indeed for that presentation. Sorry, we kind of had a snafu with the final version, but we'll work that out and we can make that available, I guess, to everybody that's joined. But yeah, so Joseph, I kind of would like to open it up. I mean, we've got a good 15-20 minutes left. I see John has already, before I've even said, please put your hand up if you want to ask a question so we don't have a rugby scrum. I'll let John kind of go first, and if people just raise their hand if you've got something to ask. So fire away, John.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you, Joseph, for the presentation. First of all, I'll make a comment and then a question. Back when the mergers and the sharing of equipment started, I don't think it took a genius to figure out that we would get to exactly where we are today, with the pricing appearing to be anti-competitive for sure, and all the things that have happened with the pricing going to $16,000 a container when it was $3,000 originally. Now the issue obviously was that the individual lines with their own ships, they were racing to the bottom because they were all lowering their prices just to keep active. So the logic became, well, let's share a vessel. But the issue here is now that It's really gotten the attention in the US of the Department of Justice, and there's been new things put in place to limit this. What do you think the chances are of eliminating their, I guess, protection under anti-competition? Because that's certainly where this has gone.
See, there's a bill right now before Congress which asks for repeal of the antitrust protection. That has not yet been passed. There's been some strong controversy as to whether this bill should be passed, because they say that if you break up the alliances, what will happen? The liners won't be able to share the extra space on the carriers. This would result in higher cost per container for moving the containers, because these larger ships enable someone to provide lower cost to transport by the containers. So that's the argument. And they say it would throw the whole industry in chaos. And so the people who are fighting for it, the ship owners basically saying, if you do this, it would create a great degree of chaos in the industry. This question of antitrust, removing the antitrust immunity is not a new one. It has been going on for 30 years. In fact, before shipping alliances came into the picture, there were conference agreements, but those guys had an agreement on prices, on sharing of profits, pooling of revenues, and everything, all the commercial aspects. But these alliances don't cover those aspects. They just cover the sharing of the vessels, the itineraries, and so forth. So they said they are not covering the commercial aspects. They're basically trying to provide consumers with efficiencies of lower cost of containers by transporting them on larger ships. So that's basically the argument.
Yeah. So the commercial aspects of it, and I certainly understand sharing of equipment and the efficiencies that is, but the bottom line is the commercial aspects became a wink and nod between the carriers. That's exactly what happened there. And if the in the original, in the start of this whole thing, with the race to the bottom that was going on, again, in a race to the bottom, eventually the bottom falls out and various players follow, like Hanjin did, et cetera, et cetera. So those that could not be profitable in the existing environment, because obviously there was too many shipping lines, they because of business being what it is, you have the right to succeed or to fail. And if they fail, they fail. And then that, if they were allowed to have failed, not all would have failed, some would have succeeded. The smarter operators would have succeeded, just like in any business, and larger ships would have been developed. And that's how this would have been done. But instead of this, it created this ability for carriers to stay in business that really had no business being in business. That's my thought on it. That's all I'm saying.
When that happened, there were two crises in the shipping industry in 2015 and 2005, and then in 2015. When the industry failed, they merged with other countries. Other companies bought other companies, and some of the shipping alliances became bigger and bigger. As a result of this, the 10 largest companies now control 86% of the business. Yeah. And all of these shipping carriers are in the alliances, except for the last one. But the last one also has some agreements with one of the alliances. But the recent report of the FMC, the last report, indicated that they could not find any evidence that these shipping carriers had agreed among prices. Though, as you say, there's always a possibility of tacit collusion and so forth. You don't have to be a genius to be able to say, let me copy somebody else's rates and so forth. And if somebody else raises their rates, let me raise their rates. But there is no evidence that one person actually met with somebody or agreed with somebody to sort of fix the rates. And when there is a shortage in capacity as it presently happened, you get this tremendous rise in rates, because they pointed out the rise in rates were basically because of the shortage of containers. And they were charging excessive detention, demurrage and detention fees.
But the shortage of containers, and I'll just finish off with this, but the shortage of containers was somewhat self-controlled as well, because the ports on the West Coast couldn't get enough empties returned, because the ships were steaming back real quick after offloading so that they could get another load to come in at $16,000 per. And so, and again, I could, anybody can figure this one out. I can make more money by pulling my ship and sending them back quick, be it empty or with a moderate amount of empties to facilitate their requirements for some weight, but then come in again. So again, it was all, nobody could prove it, but it was a wink and nod.
So I think we've got a bit of a queue lining up with other questions. So let's move on to the other one. Yeah, I mean, but having said that, I'm going to use kind of the compares kind of advantage of, I mean, the other thing is COVID was such an unusual event as well. I mean, it just, every single industry was wholly disrupted in a way that nobody had ever anticipated, and still are now. I mean, look at the labor issues people are having. And so, kind of maybe it's a one-off, and things in 5 years' time will be back to where we were, where they're not making very much money. And maybe this is the best format. But let's let Fred kind of jump in with his question. You can come back to me on mine later, Joseph. But so Fred, if you go on off mute and you can ask your point.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how the lines are going to avoid another rate war come 2024, when we get this current mess ironed out a bit, which has got about 15% of the fleet tied up in various at anchor, and a huge order book for new container ships. I see us heading right back into the 2015-2016 situation, as far as provided there isn't a whole bunch of schedule shenanigans.
Well, the thing, I feel that if a recession comes in and there's a lot of capacity being on the order books, it may once again lead to excess capacity and a possibility of rate wars, and a situation that happened before the demand for containers, because the shipping industry is known to suffer from something we call a pig cycle, where rates go up and then rates go down and so forth. And sometimes they have an industry where they make money and then they lose money. But the problem with this particular period, as I mentioned, in 2021, they made $190 billion. That is the average profits for the last 10 years before that was $1 billion, 750 to $1 billion. And in 1 year, they made $190 billion. That is, if the normal things took place, it would take 190 years to make that money.
Well, I understand that side. I just don't see that they can hold it, given what the overhang of capacity. A lot of this stuff that they made their big profit on was their own self-inflicted nonsense in building a supply, never bothering to return empties long before the collapse in demand. They've never adopted a sort of a one-off, one-on system, so they're really out of control in many respects.
The argument that they give for returning these containers was that they were making more money on sending manufactured goods from China than sending walnuts from California to China. The rate of return on the manufactured goods was much higher. So what they did was they took the empties and sent it back straight to China. And in fact, two shipping lines in the newspaper reported, both Costco and OOCL, had more empty containers being transported back to China than full containers.
Well, yes,
and that's what the FMC is also conducting an investigation into this question of empty containers. It's still ongoing, so I can't tell you what the outcome is yet, but why they did that, their logic was we are making more money by sending manufactured goods from China. So we take the empties back to China straight rather than send it back to the agricultural sector. So
well, I think that was, if I just could say, that was a matter of sheer stupidity on the part of the lines amongst their many pieces of stupidity during this period, in that if they didn't think messing up American agriculture would not attract the U.S. legislators, they were idiots, and there were a bunch of idiots. Otherwise, keeping empties in North America has made a lot of people quite comfortable, including John.
It says the agriculture sector saying that they lost $632 million in exports because of the practice of these carriers. And so the FMC is trying to investigate what's happening. So what?
But yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a fascinating kind of case what happened, and of course there's no requirement for them to do that. I'm not aware they've got operating agreements with the ports or any other customers in terms of what they have to be done. Everybody just assumes that kind of makes business logic. And as Fred says, you just don't want to get yourself in the firing line or in the sights of regulators and whole kind of governments that are feeling that pain as a result of your behavior. I mean, yeah, it's incredibly short-sighted. So Jeff, you're still there. I'll let you kind of come in with your question next.
Yeah, I'll make it quick. I'm with the railroads, and we're definitely seeing a slowdown in intermodal and carload traffic. And our economist says that after the Christmas rush, we're going to see a real decline. So is it possible this will all be settled even before 2024 with a significant drop in demand? Thank you.
Joseph, we can't hear you. You're there.
It's possible, but just by looking at the figures right now, port figures on the East Coast, they indicate that they've reached record levels in imports. And same thing on the West Coast, they indicate the imports are very high. So how it will affect the railways largely depends on the imports from them. It's possible that as the railway data shows that for the year there's been a decline, but I'm just wondering whether it has come in from certain commodities, internal commodities that the railways transport rather than from exports coming from outside.
Yeah, obviously we don't have time to explore that in detail. I'll just say that it's our belief that we're going to be seeing a recession as early as the beginning of the year.
The thing is that this recession is, I spoke to my financial advisor a couple of days ago, and he said they are predicting a recession next year. But I feel sort of in Canada, for instance, we have unemployment at its lowest level. Demand has increased tremendously, and the fact that last year the U.S. president gave $1.9 trillion packages to people because of COVID-19. It pumped in a very substantial amount of money into the economy. And this is all having an effect on the economy. Now, true, the Federal Reserve and all has been raising their interest rates. But will this have an effect? Similarly, they're going after it by competition policy and by monetary policy. Will this have an effect? We're all hoping that it does, but nobody is absolutely certain, because nobody's certain that whether this 9.1% inflation that came out last month is going to be the highest. It could go even higher.
Good. So Joseph, I don't want us to stray too far off the topic, but I think the kind of the point, I suppose, is if there's this collapse in demand, whether it's brought on by the recession or not, or that change, I think that was the point from Jeff. Could this kind of, eliminate what's seen as this huge kind of major issue? Things will just regulate and kind of come back to maybe a normality. which we don't know. But I mean, you know, government tends to work behind the curve rather than ahead of it. So we'll kind of, by the time, you know, what they do, then they're solving a problem that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, regarding your recession, as I mentioned, I spoke to financial advisor a couple of days ago, and he says they're predicting a recession next year. That's what I keep on hoping it doesn't happen, because already, if you look at your Dow Jones has gone from 35 to 30,000, and Canada has gone from something like right at the top of 21,000 to 18,300 and so forth. So all indications are that already we've been badly hit this year. Is it going to be even worse? I don't know.
Well, so, okay, we are coming up to kind of the end of the hour, but I want to at least give OG a chance to ask your question. So thank you for being patient. So fire away.
And thank you very much, everyone. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. This was a very thought-provoking conversation this evening, and I apologize for being late. First of all, there are obvious things that we have acknowledged, like John had mentioned, that if they have set things straight in respect to the alliance, so many people who have no business to be in the business will somehow whistle out, meaning that M&A will happen so rapidly. And on the other flip side, with respect to containerization and how empty containers are being moved, I mean, at a cost which drives down to downstream of end consumer, could be how this organization are innovative enough to understand what they could do in partnership with their partners to determine how to manage bullwhip effects that influence the demand and supply. So since we know some of these things that may likely happen, the question now will be how positioned or how can we create some advisory corridor that could help 2-3 organizations to be more innovative with respect to how they can predictively align with, first, the required technology that will make that sector of the economy, since, I mean, transportation, demand and supply of goods and services determine a lot of things, and tied to the economy, because politics and economy are very much intertwined. How do we help not just the policy provider and regulatory provider, but the entrepreneur side, the business, to position to come up with what will work? Because it's something that have not worked for 30 years. There are 2 things that are in that corridor. One is there's a motivation. The motivation is, how am I playing as a big player? If I am Costco, or if I am the bigger players in the shipping line, whether it's for large crude carrier or for just container goods, it doesn't matter. But if I'm the big player, how am I managing? A lot of shipping companies bought off some large share, even in the airline industry and some other things, to increase their jet for transportation. So my concern is, I think at this point, we have come to the peak of, yes, we need to be able to create a fair regulation within the US waterfronts, and to ensure that whatever it is that we're doing at the international front are in sync with, you know, having some regulatory approach to solving that balance we're seeking for. Since at the end of the day, it influences the consumer goods at the end of the day because of how much volume we pull from the Pacific corridor. So how do we,
bring it home? Yeah.
How do we influence these major players, that cooperation, that will help them to stop fighting, but bring on board a possible way to solve that problem through a widespread enterprise strategy?
Good, great. So, Joseph, I kind of I think that's an excellent question. Basically, rather than regulation, is there a way of incentivizing, motivating that change through kind of adoption of better work practices, business process, innovation and technology? I think are kind of the better answer there.
The shipping alliances are basically indicating that they have more shipping ships on the order books so that they will increase the capacity of the number of containers that they can carry. But regarding regulations and all, you know that there are, the US government has a bill right now before it. It passed a bill in 2000, it passed a shipping act in 2018. It has passed a act in June 2022. And they're tightening the measures, closer cooperation between the FMC and the Department of Justice. They're conducting investigation onto those charges which have gone up dramatically, demurrage and detention charges. They're looking into the question of empty carriers. From the regulatory side, at least in the United States, they're doing all that they can to sort of nip the growth of inflation. In Australia, the ACCC, the competition bureaus were considering this matter, but just as they were going to determine whether there should be an exemption, the Productivity Commission sort of started looking at the matter. So ACCC sort of held its own with its recommendation. The question is, again, here, should shipping alliances be granted an exemption from the antitrust laws? And so that question goes on. And of course, in Europe, consortia were granted an exemption till 2024. They review the legislation after every 5 years, and in 2020, they gave it an exemption. They renewed the exemption to 2025. I don't know whether they are doing anything, but all we know is we see these reports. The only thing that they're currently doing right now between countries is a joint investigation by United States, UK, Australia, and Canada. That's all at the level, but getting any international laws, I think
well, yeah, I think that was the other point. I mean, you know, is there another leg to this stool than just regulation and legislation? And is there a way of motivating a change which improves the market conditions for everybody, the entire supply chain? And it's done because it makes commercial sense to do that, but not from a monopolistic perspective. So I'm really conscious, kind of, we've gone over time a little bit, and Fred's got his hand up again, and I'll let you take the liberty of asking that or making a final point, Fred, and then I guess we ought to really wrap this up. So.
Yeah, I guess we've been concentrating on the American influence and some of the European influence, but the people that have been really hurt through this screw up in the supply chain has been Bangladesh, India, Africa. You know, the people that are relying on reliable transshipment services have been really hammered in many, many respects. And my dog is telling me I have to go too. He's yelling at me.
I should also mention that the present Ukraine-Russian problems have not made the problems worse. So, you know, yes. So what can happen is very sort of fluid right now. We just don't know. And
please excuse me while I attend to my dog.
Go ahead. Yeah, I think, I mean, the problem is, Joseph, you've raised such a huge topic. You know, we've kind of been educated, I think, on the history, and certainly there are a lot of detail in terms of what's happened with alliances, the legislative kind of challenges to that, and what's happened recently. I have to say it's been a real insightful presentation, and thank you again also for taking our questions as well. I hope you're okay with me sharing your slides with the folks here.
No, no problem. I'll send my slides for you. And I've written a paper on it, and I hope that I can present it at the next CTRF proceedings and then make my presentation. So I'm continuously doing work on this, and I'm also been working on the actual laws that govern the conference and consortia legislation. Because basically, in the United States is a Shipping Act. Because the Shipping Act, as you probably all know, it came into being in 1916. Then there were 2 congressional reports, and it was amended in 1960. Then there were major amendments in 1984. Since then, everything was quiet. It's only in 2018 and 2022 that there have been 2 major amendments to this act. Yeah. And it's basically a question of granting shipping conferences and all these agreements an exemption from the Sherman Act, which if they didn't have that exemption, any price collusion activity would have been a criminal offense.
I mean, Joseph, just on that, I mean, it kind of, I think just that really brings out the degree of knowledge and experience you have in all of this. I think it would be helpful as well. We'll also share maybe a reference to where people can read more about your work at the research board. And even if you recommend certain things that we could access, that would be fantastic. We'll send that to everybody as a follow-up. So I'll talk to you about that tomorrow, and then we can wrap that up. So listen, everybody, I know we tried to keep this to an hour, but I mean, I think we've got an excuse this time because this really was a kind of a meaty topic. I would again, thank you again, Joseph, and thank you everyone for joining. We'll do this all again in a month's time, I will stop the recording now, and we'll post that so you can share that link to anybody that you think might be interested in hearing and seeing this at a later date. So thank you everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, Joseph. It was a good presentation. Thank you, Andrew.